I want to get your take. Like, data can be so useful for doing good. Definitely data can be used for bad. So what would be some ethical principles for you that you use? Yeah, what helps to guide you in the way you use data?
There's like a whole like a whole field of thought and like a whole curriculum you can take in university and things like that that teaches this.
Yeah.
But if I were to like just distill some of the ones that come to mind for me, I think people always say things like make objective use of your data, right?
Yeah.
But that's not true lah. Like no one's ever like 100% objective. As I said, like even when you're using data for good, so to speak, you're not objective.
You have your own perspective of what is good.
Yeah, you have a goal and you have your own perspective of what is good, and you have a goal to support, right? Yeah. Hypothesis that you really want to test. But I think what we usually recommend is we don't kind of like, I guess, fudge the data. I mean, I don't mean fudge in a way that like, oh, you like purposely put in data that's like not accurate, but when you look at your insights, you don't focus on the wrong thing, and you don't, try to misrepresent what's actually shown in the data. So I think recently somebody showed me an example about a very famous, actually not famous lah, but quite a well circulated visualization about how, I think it was related to war and the number of deaths in certain parts of the world. And that data was actually a declining trend, but they colored it red. Right, and they flipped it around like so that it was, the bars were coming from the top of the page down rather than bottom up. And it gave people this impression that like, wow, like so many people are dying. That is true, but it is a declining trend, right? So how we color and how you present that data, there's a certain, I guess, ethics that govern that, right? And you don't want to deceive people to make it seem like, oh, actually it's not, so bad. And we've seen this also in examples sometimes in presentations like that we give, like, that big companies give to the public, or, in news reports or not so much news reports. Like, I think an example comes to mind that I saw on the internet that, for example, in one of the reports by the Singapore, I think is it the police force or the prison service, they showed sort of like a little bar chart of, how many sort of the incidents of like, drug offenses versus like other offenses, for example. And then the bar chart for the drug offense was relatively short. And then somebody redid that visualization and corrected the scale. And you could see it's like a lot more, right? So, I mean, I'm not saying that they are trying to mislead, but there is a certain degree of ethics that will govern like how you should represent data. And you should be trying to do it as accurately as possible lah. Like not skew the scale or not try to like color it in a way that like you focus on the wrong thing.
Yeah.
The other thing is also we try to avoid, what we call correlation is not necessarily causation.
Unpack that.
Yeah. So I think people always, say that, but they don't fully know what it means. So for example, when we look at COVID numbers, like rise and fall in certain contexts of situations. And let's say like Singapore right now, like the XBB is kind of like, raging on. And we will make certain presumptions, right? Like we will say, for example, oh, Singapore lifted the restrictions at this point. That's why now XBB is like everywhere. And then let's say like next week, the government like, okay, everyone wear masks, right? And then presumably XBB comes down, people will make the relationship of like correlationship, right? Is causation. They will say, oh, because cooling measures, therefore lower COVID numbers. We don't know that is 100% true unless we run like, some sort of proper like sciences driven, methodology to test, right? On or like really contact trace to like, the ninth degree to make sure that like we're getting the correct data. So this is a correlation, a strong correlation, but it's still not direct causation, right? Direct causation is like in scientists, I guess in the medical field especially, we would do experiments, right? Like if you give, drug A to patient A and then you give the same drug to patient B, like if they react differently, that's causation. You have control factors and to test like, the same environment, right? So there are some things that there are strong correlationships, but we cannot presume causation. This is an example that I guess it's less common, but like some of the other bigger mistakes that people make around this correlation is not causation thing is, for example, especially if used for like a bad intention lah. So like in the US, people would like map the trend of abortions against like really silly things, to show that like, oh yeah, it's a bad thing, you shouldn't have done that, for example. And I think if you just Google correlation is not causation and you click like the images tab, you will see a lot of examples. I remember seeing one like on how like ice cream sales and the number of shark attacks have the same trend, the exact same like line pattern, but it doesn't mean it's related to each other, right? So even though two things have a similar trend, it also doesn't mean that they are linked.
Like the more people eat vanilla ice cream, the more the shark will attack
Correct.
someone in Australia.
Yeah, correct. It's not some secret butterfly effect that's like, like passing through the atmosphere. But that is also something that we generally avoid.
Okay. So I guess whether we know it or not, right? We are all sitting on a bunch of data. We are all telling our own stories about data, whether it's a skillful telling or a very ill-informed storytelling, right? So we are all to some degree like a noob data analyzer.
Yes.
Whether we know it or appreciate or not, right? So what would be some simple questions you would challenge everyone to ask themselves so that you can be a better data analyzer today?
Wow.
just simple
like
ones.
about their personal lives.
Or like, like we're looking at data every day. We're making judgments, right? About like stuff that people put in front of us. So like what would be like really simple questions you would say if we just learn to ask ourselves that, we would be already much better as a data analyzer, data whatever?
I guess for me, the predominant question is if you have a certain judgment of a certain situation or person or organization, is that judgment coming from confirmation bias or, can you disprove that with some degree of data? Yeah, so that would link to, again, coming to the question of, is the information you have inclusive?
Right.
Like, are you considering opinions and inputs from other sources or other people that you haven't already considered? And is it representative? Like, are your experiences telling of what's actually going on, right? So I think people will anecdotally always say things like, I'm going to a bit of a not so great territory here, but when we talk about racism, for example, and there are some people who would cling onto their racism and be like, oh, in all my interactions with certain race group type A, they are always like that, right? So they are actually uttering a data point, right? And they're trying to convince you that, oh, my data point is...
Or rather like their insight.
Yeah, their insight. Yeah. Like, it's correct, it's true.
Yeah,
like
all
out of 100 times...
people group A
correct.
are bad.
And you always hear this from taxi drivers, like always. So yeah, they'll be like, don't bluff you on, like every time I meet this type of person, then this is the outcome, right? But then you need to ask, like, is it confirmation bias? Like, really is like, out of 99 customers you pick up, all of them behave in the exact same pattern? Or, are you just remembering the ones that made you unhappy?
So is it like, if I want to get taxi driver to be a bit more data driven in their answer, I would ask something like, oh, uncle, how many people X did that to you?
I mean, they will say like many.
got many.
Yeah. But then you have to ask like, but how many out of how many, right? Like every single one, man, that sort of thing. Like,
then you change the story.
Yeah. They will make ask Grab, export your driving history to check.
Okay, I see.
But I mean, conversations around race, that's one. But I guess you could apply it also to other social phenomena. I think it's a bit tangential, but a few years ago, internally in our team, we did like a little workshop for our own writers on data storytelling, and we had an exercise where we taught them how to map, right? There are the things around them, geography, right? And our colleague was somebody who's living in Pasir Ris. She's Muslim, and then she mapped what sort of food decisions she'll make in Pasir Ris, and then she learned that actually her lifestyle is very unhealthy, in the sense that she always eats very unhealthy food. And then and I think if you just look at that data, you would be like, oh, then eat healthier lah. Like, you would just presume, right? But then we realized that geography plays a big part in your lifestyle. And not in the sense that like, oh yeah, you got park to exercise in. But, for Muslims living in a certain geography, they are limited by the number of halal options that are available to them. And in Pasir Ris, then like predominantly like fast food lah. Convenience food, which is not healthy, right? So there is a relationship among some of these things. And I think like, as average Singaporeans, sometimes we, also make remarks about certain trends and certain behaviors and knowing, I think, context and difficulties, like asking, is this the most nuanced or the most contextualized reading I have of the data is pretty important too. I mean, we won't ask ourselves that question. Like, it's very cheap to be like, oh, is my analysis or judgment of this situation contextualized? No, like, nobody will ask that. But I guess empathy, practicing a strong sense of empathy in making decisions or, before we presume to say like, my experience tells me this, like maybe to question that further and ask like, am I empathizing with the person who is involved in this data? And is there anything I can do to, make a more educated or more informed opinion? Yeah, empathy is probably like a good practice to have in general.
So if we had to bring like our big data like skills and like what does this have to do with me conversation to the person on the street. And so let's say it really is this young budding data scientist, data storyteller who's like, hey, I'm noticing like I'm not having like some of the best options to eat because of the neighborhood I'm in. Like a data-driven way to advocate for change for their situation, aside from let me just eat healthier, might be to actually track like how many let's say like halal friendly, halal certified like places do I have actually in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
Bother to put it in a nice story.
Yeah.
And then like next time like go MPS. Like go meet the people session like, hello.
Show the MP.
I'm not here to complain, but I had this beautiful data story to tell you.
It's really true. I mean, we've done the same sort of analysis about the transport system, and the LTA does this very well, I'm sure. Like they have an internal, data set where they map like where the buses visit, and they know like where are the traffic hotspots, right? They know in certain areas, particularly like we should run more bus services here because, peak hour like it's congested, right? But the same methodology can be applied to like things like halal food options. Like how far does one person need to travel to get a meal, or how much money do they need to spend to order in that meal, right? Again, then it comes to time, right? Like there's a time cost. Then if geography is a limitation, then that means the alternative is you cook your own food, right? And that also takes time. Yeah. So these are actually pretty important decisions in making like the landscape like I guess more equal and more fair. Yeah.